Hi, and welcome to my video on how to film wildlife. I'll cover which types of camera you can use, which lenses are best suited, and some other equipment that will be useful. Then I'll go through the settings to use to get the best results, and finish up with some useful techniques and tips. Now, when I first started doing wildlife filmmaking properly, I noticed there were hundreds of videos on YouTube about wildlife photography, but very few on wildlife filmmaking. That's changed a little bit now, but there's still not many videos on wildlife filmmaking out there. So I thought I'd make this one for anyone that was just starting out or getting a bit more serious about doing their wildlife filmmaking and wanted to learn some basic tips. I thought I'd share what I've learned over the last few years. So let's start with the very basics, cameras. Now this could be a subject of a video or perhaps a series of videos on their own, but there's a few different options out there. Of course, you can start off with a mobile phone. Now most modern smartphones have a decent camera these days, usually shoots at least 4K, sometimes more, which will give a nice good quality video. And it can be really good for stuff you can get close to in good light. And often there's a lot of internal processing going on in the phone itself, which helps improve the image quality. The problem comes with phones is when you get really low light, because the small sensor and the small lens can give you a really grainy or noisy image. The other issue is a lot of wildlife is far away. Although some phones do have a decent telephoto lens built into them, it's not really up to the job of filming wildlife. And in the end, it is a phone that has a camera built into it. There's some good compact cameras out there that have some decent video functions, and while they're still quite small, some of them have 12 or 20 times zoom on, which is equivalent of a 400 or 600mm lens. So they can be quite useful, but again, they're still slightly limited, often don't have a viewfinder and a small sensor that can be quite noisy. And the lens probably isn't quite as good a quality as most of these following options. The next step up is a bridge camera. So this is a compact style camera, but it's a bit bigger, has a bigger lens, often a bigger sensor, and some of these have ridiculous 3000mm focal length lenses built into them. So they're better than a phone or normal compact camera. But just like the phone and the compact camera, the autofocus isn't quite as good as some of the other options. Although, as we'll find out, autofocus isn't all that critical. One plus point of these three cameras is a lot of them, especially the phones and some of the bridge cameras, do really good high frame rate or slow motion video. Some of these do 120, 240, 300 frames per second, as we'll see later, can be really useful in wildlife filmmaking. Camcorders are another option. Many of these have large zooms with good reach, 3, 4, 600mm focal length, and I've seen some pretty good results here on YouTube with people filming with them, but I have to say I haven't used camcorders that much. But I think the best option for most people starting out is a DSLR or mirrorless camera that have interchangeable lenses. Many of you watching, of course, will probably already own one of these cameras to do wildlife photography, and you simply just have to switch them into video mode to use them for video. As most modern cameras will do at least 30 frames per second in HD quality, usually 4K, and many do 6 or 8K and higher frame rates. I'll just mention the cinema cameras, which are probably the ultimate option and what they use in most of the nature documentaries, but we're talking 10, 20, 30, 40,000 pounds for those cameras. So unfortunately, I don't have much experience using those, and by much, I mean zero experience, as they're all well out of my budget. Now, when it comes to which specific camera to use, there are loads of options, some better than others for video, and some will be better depending on what kind of wildlife filmmaking you'll be doing. I personally use Panasonic. I'm currently shooting on the Panasonic G8.6, and if you want to know why I use that camera, I've got a whole video on it I'll put a link to in the comments. As there's so many options, I'd rather do a more in-depth video on what camera you should use, but rather similar to still photography, if you shoot with a full frame camera with a larger sensor, it's going to have better low light capabilities with less noise. If you shoot with a micro four thirds sensor like I do, it will be on average slightly more noisier, but because it's got a 2 times crop factor, I'll have more reach, so my lenses will effectively get twice as close as a full frame lens. And of course the crop sensor, which is a sensor size in between the two, will in both terms of noise and reach be somewhere in the middle. So let's quickly talk about lenses. Again, if you shoot wildlife photography, some of this will sound familiar. A 3 or 400mm lens is ideal for filmmaking. If you're shooting on a crop sensor or a micro four thirds sensor, you might get away with slightly less focal length, certainly a 300mm, as of course a 300mm on a 2 times crop micro four thirds sensor gives you the equivalent of 600mm reach. You can also use teleconverters, which will give you more reach, so a 2 times teleconverter will double the reach of your lens. But obviously it costs you light. For reasons I'll explain later on, that could be beneficial. The ideal lens for most wildlife filmmaking is a telephoto zoom, rather than a prime lens, as this will enable you to get a variety of shots, which will be useful when you're editing a video together later, but also allows you to react to the animal as it moves and to keep it in frame or comes in closer than you expect it to. That said, I did shoot for a few years, mostly on a 300mm prime
with a teleconverter, which when the wildlife is a long way away is actually really useful. But there were many times that I missed the ability to zoom, so I ended up switching to a zoom lens. All that's fine for birds and mammals and stuff like that, but if you want to shoot insects, you're probably going to need a macro lens, and your macro lens you use for macro photography will be useful here. Because you're filming insects moving, however, you don't always need to get quite so close, so if you've got a lens that can focus quite close up, that might be useful. And I found using a long prime or telephoto zoom with close focus ability can be really good for filming insects. And having a wide angle lens is also useful. You might want to film stuff like this of yourself talking to the camera or someone else. It's also great for filming habitat shots of where your wildlife lives and for B-roll footage, which I'll talk about a bit more later. Of course, if you're shooting with a bridge camera or a camcorder, you should be able to zoom in and out, and many of these have macro modes that let you get closer, or you can get attachable macro lenses, just like you do with stills, that you can use for filming stuff close up. So that's the cameras and lens covered, but there's some more equipment we need to talk about. Other than the camera and the lens, the most important bit of equipment for wildlife filmmaking is a tripod. My wildlife filmmaking improved massively when I started using a tripod. Yes, it's a pain in the butt, first of all to lug around a tripod, and secondly to set it up and use it. Now most cameras and lenses have image stabilization built into them, but when you get to 400mm, although that's perfectly fine for stills, when you're shooting video, it's usually not good enough to keep the camera steady enough for video. And there's very little worse, other than maybe it being out of focus, than having some good footage ruined by camera shake. Now obviously there'll be times you can handhold and get away with it, when you're shooting in slow motion and at shorter focal lengths, such as I did here, filming insects visiting flowers. But most of the time, to get a nice steady shot, you need to use a tripod. It also enables you to do panning shots and tilting shots a lot more easily. And of course, if you're standing around waiting for something, it takes the weight of the camera too. So although it's a bit of a pain, the pluses outweigh the negatives in my view. But what really helps when using a tripod is to have a proper video head. Most tripods come with a ball head, which is great for stills, but not quite so good for video. And you can use the gimbal heads, they're not too bad, they're all right for video, but the best thing to use is a video head, preferably a fluid video head. Now, up until recently, I've been using this Manfrotto 502 video head, and it served me very well. It's getting a bit worn out now, but I've had it for over 10 years, so it's done really well. And that seems to be a popular choice with people starting out. But there's a few other options that are very similar too. What you're looking for is a head that will not only smoothly pan and tilt, but has adjustable resistance as well. So it makes it a lot easier to do pans and tilts and get smooth footage when you can adjust how much resistance it gives you. And of course, there are some situations like in hides, or if you're shooting from your car, where you can use a big beanbag to support the camera. But the key point here is to have good support for your camera to stop the camera shaking. There's plenty more video equipment that can help you, but that's probably a subject for another video. So let's talk some video basics. Let's start with shutter speed and frame rate. The difference between the two is something beginners often struggle with. I know I certainly did. What made it easier for me to understand was to think of video as a long burst of photos, which I suppose in a way it is. And the shutter speed is the time each frame of that video is exposed for. So if your shutter speed is 1/50th of a second, each frame of the video will be exposed for 1/50th of a second. And the frame rate, which is measured in FPS or frames per second, is how many frames per second there are in the video. And once you've got that in your head, it makes everything else a lot easier, I find. And apologies if you already knew that and found that a bit condescending, but it might help a few people like me that were struggling. Depending on where you are in the world and where the video has been displayed, the frame rate of videos tends to be 24, 25, or 30 frames per second. To give a nice smooth look to your video, you need to shoot with a shutter speed that is double your frame rate, or at least as near as you can. In fact, when you're shooting, you actually want any movement in your frames to be slightly blurred, as you can see here in this freeze frame, as otherwise it does not look natural.
So, for example, if you shoot at 25 frames per second, which is the standard for the UK, you need to use a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second. When I'm shooting fast moving wildlife though, I tend to shoot at 100 frames per second, so then I need a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. And if, like me, you have a more video focused camera, you may have an even simpler way of doing this, where you can actually change your shutter speed to shutter angle and set it to 180 degrees, which will always set the shutter speed at double your frame rate.
Now this can create issues when it comes to exposure, as whether it's dark, cloudy, rainy or sunny, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you need to be shooting with a shutter speed of 1/50th of a second, which means the only two ways of you controlling your exposure are to either adjust the aperture or the ISO. This is one important difference between video and photography. Unless you're doing something creative in wildlife photography, generally you're going for as high shutter speed as possible. And as you now know, quite often in wildlife filmmaking, you're going to be shooting with a very low shutter speed of 1/50th or 120th of a second, which is much slower than a lot of wildlife photography. This can be both a blessing and a curse. If you're shooting stills in poor light and the creature's moving, you're going to need 500th or 1000th of a second shutter speed, which will probably mean cranking up the ISO really high and getting horrible, noisy images. If you're filming the same scene at 24 frames per second, you only need 1/50th of a second shutter speed to get the correct exposure and nice flowing video. And you can probably do all that while still shooting at f8 or f11 to get the depth of field you need. For this bitten footage, although it was really dull, I kept the ISO down to ISO 800 while shooting at f11, and I still managed to get this lovely footage. But of course there's a flip side. In bright sunny conditions, you might find even if you go down to ISO 100, you're still overexposed at 1/50th of a second, which will mean you either have to up your frame rate, which might not be the look you're going for because you might not want slow motion, or you have to put the aperture up to f8, f11, or perhaps even more, which can give you too much depth of field, ruining the whole look of the video, and through diffraction can soften your image. Personally, my setup is usually f8 or f11 at its widest aperture anyway, so this doesn't affect me too often. But on really bright days, when I'm shooting with 24 frames per second, so 50th of a second shutter speed, I have at times had to go down to f20 aperture, which is not ideal. Now in this scenario, you can use something called an ND filter. Some of you may be familiar with these from especially landscape photography. And this basically blocks out some of the light with minimal loss of image quality and allows you to bring your shutter speed down without having to resort to extreme apertures. The only other option, of course, as I've just briefly touched on, is you can shoot at a higher frame rate, so you need a higher shutter speed, and that can compensate for your exposure problems. But as I've already mentioned, that might not be the video footage you desire. And I'll talk a bit more about what frame rates to use when later in the video. Going back to aperture, I typically shoot at f8 to f11, as I've already mentioned. Even when I'm not using a teleconverter, I'll often shoot at least at f8. This is because when you're filming, you're typically going to be trying to film something that moves, or at least you're anticipating will be moving, and it's a lot easier to keep a subject in focus if you've got a larger depth of field. Though, of course, as I've already mentioned, if you start going beyond f8, f11, do be careful of diffraction softening your image. On the other hand, you may find a situation where you want to isolate your subject, but for reasons we've already discussed, you may need to use an ND filter to get the correct exposure. When it comes to focusing, when you're filming wildlife, that usually means using manual focus. Autofocusing on cameras for stills these days is absolutely mind-blowing, especially with the subject detect built in, stuff like that these days. Absolutely fantastic. But the video autofocus on many cameras is somewhat lacking. I know on my GH6 it's basically hopeless, especially shooting f11, although it is improving all the time. Even cameras with good autofocus are often optimized to track people and subjects that are closer to the camera. And wildlife has a horrible habit of going into areas with messy backgrounds, making it even harder for autofocus to follow. And of course, even the best autofocus can sometimes suffer from pulsing, where the focus goes back and forth rapidly, and that can totally ruin your video. So it's best to have full control by manually focusing. To help with manual focusing, it's a good technique to press record and then just concentrate on staying in focus and tracking your subject. All that said, if I've got a subject that's sat on a perch or sitting on the ground, I will use autofocus to quickly lock onto it and start recording, and then use manual focus to stay on it if it moves. There's two very useful things I found that have helped with manual focusing. The first one is focus peaking. With a DSLR, you can't use it through the viewfinder, but you can often use it on the back screen or LCD screen on the camera. But with mirrorless cameras, it seems to be on most makes and models now. What focus peaking is, it basically puts all these coloured dots on the areas that are in focus, which is really useful for seeing what you're focusing on. I usually have it set to red or bright blue, and then it shows up against the dominant greens and browns you get with wildlife. Sometimes you have to change the colour though, if your subject's the same colour as your focus peaking colours. Just watch out for that. And if you've got a stationary subject, something that can really help with focus is the magnify mode. Most cameras have it. It's usually like a magnifying glass symbol, or you can customize buttons to do this. And you press it and it zooms in 2 or 4 or 8 times. Sometimes you press the button multiple times, it zooms in more. And this will give a square in the middle of your viewfinder or screen that is magnified by that magnification. It makes it a lot easier, especially with the focus peaking combined, to focus on your subject. Something I've also found helped is a focus wheel. This is a much more comfortable way to focus the lens than using the dial on the lens itself. And I can hold my hand in that position comfortably for quite a while, which is very useful when you're having to be patient waiting for your subject to do something. And something I use, especially with macro, is a camera video monitor. This gives you a 5 or 7-inch screen with which you can really see what you're looking at, which makes it a lot easier to see what's in focus and what isn't. And a lot of them have inbuilt histograms and false color, blah, 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 lots of other features that you might find useful too. So what video settings should you use? Now, obviously it's going to vary between camera, but as a general rule, always shoot at the highest quality you can with the frame rate that you need. Most cameras at the very least will have 4K in 24 or 30 frames per second these days, and many of them will do 60 frames per second in 4K too. Now, some cameras, like my Panasonic GH6, are quite video orientated, so they have loads of options with bit rates and codecs. I tend to shoot in the highest resolution I can and the highest bit rate I can. The reason I shoot at the highest resolution and the highest bit rate is it gives you more flexibility when it comes to editing. Obviously, higher resolution means I can crop more, and higher bit rate will mean there's more information in the video when it comes to editing the exposure and color. And even if you only want to shoot for a HD video, I would still shoot 4K or whatever resolution your camera goes up to, because it does give you the option of cropping later. And if you don't need to crop, you can then downscale to HD, which should give you an even better quality than if you just shot HD in the first place. For example, my GH6 can shoot at 5.8K. Now, I never export in 5.8K, but if there's a bird in the distance, I can get a bit more reach by cropping in. And of course, if I'm shooting a macro, I can back off, get a bit more depth of field, and then crop in and get a 4K image still. And of course, there's always the option that you can do a 4K pan across a 5.8K image in the edit later. So, unless you're desperately shooting hard drive space, and you will need a lot of hard drive space if you're doing video, I would always shoot at the highest quality you can. Now, going back to frame rates, when to use what frame rate? Most wildlife filmmakers I've spoken to will shoot at 50 or 60 frames per second. Most modern cameras will shoot in their highest quality, or at least near their highest quality, at 50 or 60 frames per second. And it also has the benefit of that when you slow it down to 30 or 24 frames per second, it slows things down to half real-time speed, which slows down any action or movement the animals are making quite nicely. And it also has the added benefit of doubling the length of your clip. So if you only manage to film 5 seconds of footage, you'll actually end up with 10 seconds of usable footage once you slow it down. If you know you're not going to be slowing your footage down, you need to shoot at the frame rate of your final video. If you're recording audio for your video, such as a bird singing or a frog calling, you need to shoot at this final frame rate, as otherwise, when you slow it down, it'll distort the sound. Now, you can shoot at the higher frame rate and not slow it down, but as we've mentioned, your shutter speed will probably be too high as well, and you end up with jerky footage for the reasons we mentioned earlier in the video. For faster moving subjects, like a bird taking off, you want to shoot in even slower motion, so something like 120 frames per second, which, when slowed down to 24 frames per second, will end up with footage that's 4 times slower than real time. Now, a number of cameras do this in HD, and a few even do it in 4K, such as my GH6. But I think slow motion cameras, again, is a subject that needs a whole other video. Just to give you an idea of how I've got my camera set up, at 24 frames per second at 5.7K, 120 frames per second at 4K, and for really fast subjects like dragonflies in flight, I have 240 frames per second in HD set up as well. Audio is often something that's overlooked in video, but it's a very important part of your final video. Now, you can just use music, and you can download music for free from some websites and pay for them on other websites. But sometimes you want to get audio while you're recording. If your subject is close enough and loud enough, you can sometimes get away with the microphone built into your camera. But the problem with those microphones is they're not always the best quality, and if you get the slightest breeze, you'll get that horrible wind noise. You'll also pick up any sounds from or near the camera. Occasionally you can get away with the built-in microphone. I've got this cuckoo footage using the inbuilt microphone, but if you listen carefully, there's a lot of background noise, which thankfully was beneficial to this video, and I got extremely lucky because there was absolutely no wind that day. So it's worth investing in an external microphone. This will give you better quality sound and will make it much easier to deal with any problems you might have. A shotgun mic is very useful as it is focused in the direction in which you wish to record, which, as you can imagine, is quite useful for wildlife, which can be quite far away. And if you're filming outside, you're going to have issues with wind blowing over your microphone and ruining your audio. It's worth investing in what's called a dead cat, which will help eliminate some of the wind noise. You also need to think about minimising noise from yourself. So you need to stand still, avoid any movement and banging into things. And I often find myself holding my breath to make sure my breathing isn't picked up on the microphone. Another thing that helps is mounting the microphone as far away from you as possible, rather than mounting it on the hot shoe. Putting it on an arm or something can help minimise any noise coming from the camera or yourself. And it sounds a bit obvious, but it's a mistake I've made in the past. Make sure your microphone is pointing at your subject, especially with something like a shotgun microphone, which is quite focused. And if you're recording audio, it helps to be a bit antisocial. If you're in a hide people are going to be banging around or talking to each other, opening and shutting doors and stuff like that, which you can guarantee will happen right at the moment that the bird calls or whatever you're trying to record makes the noise. And also, if you're on a breezy day, try and find a sheltered spot. Sometimes that can help, perhaps right up against a wall on the leeward side of the wind. That can really help reduce any wind noise problems. And even if you follow all these tips, the moment you have your subject perfectly framed, about to sing, you're holding your breath, there's no wind, you can pretty much guarantee a motorbike or car will go driving past in the distance or a plane will go flying overhead. You can have the best audio gear in the world, but ultimately the best way to get good audio is to get as close as possible. But unfortunately with wildlife, obviously, you can't always do that. In the end, if push comes to shove, you can resort to using noise reduction in your editing software, although obviously it won't be quite as good as if you can get better audio in the field. And as I mentioned at the start, I often just resort to using music. And very quickly, before I go any further, if you find this video interesting or useful, please give it a like and consider subscribing for more wildlife filmmaking tips. I'm going to finish off with some more general tips. First one is make sure your camera is balanced properly on your tripod. This is much easier with a long base plate, and if your setup is mounted on your long lens. And basically just loosen your tripod so it wobbles back and forwards, and then move your camera forwards and backwards until it's pretty much balanced on your tripod and won't fall forwards or back. Which basically makes it possible to do panning and tilt shots and makes following your subject just so much easier. In most situations, I'd avoid zooming while filming. It can look good, but most of the time it's really hard to pull off smoothly in the field. Sometimes it's better to zoom out, film in a high resolution, and zoom in on software later. Another problem with zooming is that on many lenses that are not optimized for video, as you zoom in, they will go out of focus. So you have to focus and zoom at the same time, and it's just really hard to pull off. If you're filming at a really long focal length or high magnification, one good technique is to frame your shot, lock the pan and tilt on your tripod head, and just let go and let it record without you touching it. This will avoid any camera shake issues from you touching the camera and gives you a nice steady shot to work with. But of course, keep watching and be ready. And if it looks like it's going to move, you might want to unlock the tripod and be ready to pan and follow your subject. And you want to film some action, or at least have something moving in the frame. Now, I often say this in stills, but I think it's even more important in video because obviously it's meant to be a moving image, and if nothing's moving, it's a bit boring. This could obviously be the animal walking or flying, but it could also be water flowing or reeds swaying in the wind behind the subject. If you're a photographer, a lot of the rules for photography, or the so-called rules, are useful in video too. Filming in the golden hour can give you some really nice light. When framing your subject, the subject in the centre frame can look good, but you can also try using the rule of thirds, which can work well too. And getting the head, especially the eyes, in focus is generally a good place to start. Being ready is always a good thing. I walk around with my camera on the tripod, ready to place down and film, hopefully within a few seconds if I'm quick enough. If you think something's going to do something, start filming. Many cameras, especially mine, have a bit of a lag between you pressing record and it starting recording. So it's better to be recording ready and not miss the start of the action, or miss it entirely in some cases. Another thing you might notice switching from stills to video is your battery usage goes up. Video eats a lot of power, so it's always good to have either spare batteries or some sort of external power source to power your camera so you don't run out. Now, if you want to put all your clips together into a video, it's a good idea to have at least a basic idea of what sort of video you want to make so you know what shots you need to get. And to get a nice mix of shots, so wide, close in, full body shots and stuff like that. Other shots to try are the subject moving into the frame from one side, or moving out the frame, or perhaps doing both. Make sure you get some wide environmental shots of the habitat. Get some B-roll of flowers and stuff like that that aren't the main subject of your video. This can be really useful when you're editing later. B-roll, B-roll, B-roll is something someone told me years ago, and quite often I still don't do it myself. So yeah, it's useful to do that. You might want to have a second body set up with a wide angle lens just to shoot that. Another thing I'll say is just stick with it and practice. It takes quite a while to adapt doing video, especially if you've done stills to start with, but generally I'll pick a day to do video and just stick with doing it. And in some situations, just leaving your camera recording is the best way to capture the action. For example, if you've got a kingfisher on a stick and you know at some point it's going to dive, like I've done here, set up my focus, frame my shot with space for it to dive into, and just started recording and waited. It uses up a lot of space, which is why I recommend you have lots of memory cards or some large memory cards, and then I just let it run. And that way I don't miss the action. You can delete the videos with nothing in later and edit down the ones that do. And sometimes by just leaving something recording, you just get lucky. I was just recording this female emperor dragonfly egg laying, and this is the footage I ended up with. Of course, I had to react quickly when the coot took the dragonfly out the frame to record it in its beak and feeding it to its chicks. And my final tip is, if you're going to do video that day, stick to doing video, because you can guarantee if you decide to switch to stills, you'll miss a really good opportunity to film something great. If you'd like me to film something specific, perhaps one of the subjects I've suggested in this video, do let me know in the comments. I've already started recording one on filming insects, so do subscribe if you're interested in videos on wildlife filmmaking, and do give the video a like if you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.